It's funny how life works sometimes. You spend years trying to outrun your past, trying to shed the skin of who you once were, and then, just when you think you've finally done it, something comes along to yank you right back. For me, that something was a crisp, heavy cardstock envelope that landed in my mailbox one Tuesday morning. The return address was unfamiliar, but the embossed crest on the flap, a slightly wonky shield with an outdated motto, immediately sent a shiver down my spine. It was the 10-year high school reunion invitation, and let me tell you, for a moment there, my perfectly polished, meticulously constructed adult world felt like it was about to crack wide open. But let's rewind a bit, shall we? Because to truly understand why that invitation felt like such a monumental moment, you need to understand the kid who went to that school. I wasn't exactly the picture of confidence back then. In fact, I was pretty much the opposite. I was gangly, awkward, and perpetually felt like I had a giant, invisible target painted on my back. My clothes were always a little too big or a little too small. My hair seemed to have a mind of its own, and my attempts at conversation usually ended in a mumbled apology or an embarrassed silence. I was, in a word, an easy mark. The hallways of Northwood High felt less like a place of learning and more like a gauntlet I had to navigate daily. Every lunch break was a strategic operation to find an unoccupied corner, every group project an exercise in trying not to be the odd one out. The taunts, the shoves, the whispered jokes that always seemed to follow me down the corridor, they weren't just words or actions, they were bricks, slowly but surely building a wall around me, pushing me further and further into myself. There was a particular group, a trio really, led by a guy named Mark. Mark was all swagger and sharp edges, with a cruel glint in his eye that seemed to find joy in other people's discomfort. His sidekicks, Kevin and Jessica, were equally adept at making my life miserable, often joining in with a laugh or a dismissive comment that stung more than any physical blow. They made sure I knew my place, which in their eyes was somewhere far below everyone else. I remember one specific incident, vivid as if it happened yesterday. It was in sophomore year, during gym class. We were playing dodgeball, and I, being terrible at anything involving coordination, was usually the first one out. But this time, Mark and his crew decided to make a spectacle of it. They formed a circle around me, pelting me with dodgeballs, laughing as I stumbled and tried to shield myself. The gym teacher, bless his heart, was busy talking to another student, completely oblivious. I could feel the heat rising in my face, not just from the exertion, but from the sheer humiliation. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I swallowed them back, refusing to give them the satisfaction. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, I practically sprinted to the locker room, locking myself in a stall until I was sure everyone else had left. That day, I promised myself that I would never again let anyone make me feel that small, that powerless. It was a silent, desperate vow made by a scrawny teenager, but it was a vow that would eventually change everything. That promise became a slow burn, a tiny ember of defiance that smoldered within me. For a long time, it was just that. A feeling, a vague aspiration. I didn't know how to change, or even what specifically I needed to change. I just knew the current state was unsustainable. The first few steps were clumsy, almost imperceptible. I started by reading. Not just school books, but anything I could get my hands on that promised self-improvement, confidence building, or even just a distraction from my own thoughts. I devoured biographies of successful people, stories of resilience, anything that suggested there was a path out of the shadows. My parents, bless their hearts, noticed my newfound veracity for books and encouraged it, thinking I was just becoming more studious. They had no idea the internal war one was waging. Then came the physical transformation. It wasn't about becoming a hulking brute. It was about feeling stronger, more capable. I started with simple exercises in my bedroom, push-ups and sit-ups before school, awkward jogs around the block when no one was watching. The initial soreness was brutal, a stark reminder of how out of shape I was. But with each ache, each bead of sweat, I felt a tiny bit of that invisible wall around me crumbling. I started eating better too, swapping out sugary snacks for fruits and vegetables, learning about nutrition not just for my body, but for my mind. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible to others at first, but I felt them. I felt a new energy, a new clarity. My posture improved, my gaze became a little steadier. It wasn't confidence yet, not really, but it was the foundation for it. Academically, I started pushing myself too. I realized that knowledge was power, and excelling in my studies was one area where no one could truly touch me. I spent countless hours in the library, not just doing homework, but exploring subjects that genuinely fascinated me. I discovered a passion for technology, for coding, for understanding how the digital world worked. It was a world where intellect and problem-solving were valued, not athletic prowess or social standing. I found a small, online community of like-minded individuals, people who shared my interests, and for the first time, I felt a sense of belonging. These virtual connections, forged over lines of code and shared enthusiasm for obscure tech, slowly chipped away at the loneliness I felt in the real world. They validated my intelligence, my perspectives, and gave me a taste of what genuine friendship felt like. By the time senior year rolled around, I was a different person, inside and out. The gangly kid had filled out, not into a bodybuilder, but into someone lean and fit. My hair was still a bit unruly, but I'd learned to embrace it. My grades were stellar, and I'd even started a small side hustle building websites for local businesses, earning my own money for the first time. The biggest change, though, was internal. The fear was still there, a faint echo, but it no longer dictated my every move. I could look people in the eye, I could articulate my thoughts without stumbling, and I even started to develop a dry wit that occasionally surprised even myself. Mark and his crew still existed, of course, but their taunts had lost their sting. They still tried, sometimes, but their words just bounced off me, like those dodgeballs in gym class, only this time, I wasn't trying to shield myself. I was just standing there, unmoved. They seemed to sense the shift, the unbreachable barrier of my newfound self-respect, and gradually, they just faded into the background. Graduation was a blur of relief and anticipation. I packed my bags, said goodbye to my small town, and headed off to a university in a completely different state, ready to embrace a fresh start. And it was glorious. I thrived in the intellectual environment, connected with amazing people who appreciated me for who I was, and dove headfirst into my chosen field. The coding side hustle blossomed into a full-fledged startup during my sophomore year, fueled by late nights, endless coffee, and an unshakable belief in what I was building. There were failures, of course, plenty of them. Ideas that flopped, partnerships that dissolved, moments of doubt that threatened to send me spiraling back to that insecure kid. But each time, I remembered that vow I made in the locker room. I remembered the feeling of being small, and I refused to go back there. I learned from every mistake, pivoted, iterated, and pushed forward. The startup grew, slowly at first, then exponentially. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about solving problems, creating something meaningful, and building a team of passionate individuals. The financial success that followed was a byproduct, a welcome validation of all the hard work and sleepless nights. I bought my first apartment in a bustling city, a place with huge windows and a view that always reminded me of how far I'd come. I traveled, explored new cultures, learned new languages, and collected experiences that broadened my perspective far beyond the narrow confines of my high school years. My personal life flourished too. I built deep, meaningful friendships, relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. I learned to trust, to open up, to be vulnerable, something I never thought possible during those dark, lonely years. So when that reunion invitation arrived, 10 years later, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a tangible link to a past I had meticulously worked to overcome. My first instinct was to toss it, to pretend it never existed. Why would I want to revisit a place that held so many painful memories? I had built this incredible life, this vibrant, fulfilling existence, far removed from the shadows of Northwood High. But then, a different thought began to form. A quiet whisper of curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of something akin to defiance. It wasn't about proving anything to them anymore, not really. It was about proving something to myself. It was about walking back into that space, not as the scared, awkward kid, but as the person I had become, fully formed, confident, and utterly unshakable. It was about closing a chapter, not with anger or resentment, but with a quiet sense of triumph. I picked up the invitation again, tracing the embossed crest with my thumb. The date was a few months away, giving me ample time to prepare. Not that I needed to prepare in the old sense, like agonizing over what to wear or rehearsing imaginary conversations in my head. No, this preparation was different. It was about mentally steeling myself, reminding myself of the journey, of every hurdle overcome, every victory earned. It was about stepping into that room with my head held high, not for anyone else's benefit, but for my own peace of mind. I confirmed my attendance online, a simple click of a button that felt like a monumental act. In the weeks leading up to the reunion, I found myself reflecting more than usual. I revisited old journals, scrolled through ancient digital files, and even found a few dusty photo albums from those high school days. It was a strange experience, looking at pictures of that younger me. I saw the fear in my eyes, the awkward posture, the forced smile. But I also saw the potential, the nascent strength, that was just waiting to be unleashed. It wasn't a journey I would ever want to repeat, but I wouldn't trade the lessons learned for anything. The pain had forged me, tempered me, and ultimately made me stronger, more empathetic, and more resilient than I ever thought possible. I decided to treat myself to a new outfit for the reunion, something sharp, modern, and understated. Not flashy, not attention-seeking, but something that exuded quiet confidence. I wanted to feel good, truly good, in my own skin, from the inside out. I booked a flight, arranged for a rental car, and even planned a short visit with my parents, who still lived in the area. It felt like a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to my roots, but with a completely different perspective. The day of the reunion arrived, clear and surprisingly warm for late autumn. The old high school, Northwood High, looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The brick facade, the sprawling athletic fields, the familiar archway over the main entrance, they were all there, untouched by time. But my perception of them had changed. They no longer held power over me. They were just buildings, bricks and mortar, a backdrop to a chapter of my life that was now firmly in the past. The reunion itself was being held in the school's newly renovated gymnasium, a place that once represented so much dread for me. The irony was not lost. As I pulled into the parking lot, a wave of familiar anxiety tried to creep in, a phantom echo of my teenage self, but I pushed it back, taking a deep, calming breath. This wasn't about them. This was about me. I wasn't seeking validation. I was simply present, a testament to my own journey. I walked towards the entrance, my steps firm and purposeful. The sounds of muffled chatter and laughter grew louder as I approached the double doors. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The gymnasium was transformed. Fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, tables draped in white linen were scattered across the polished floor, and a DJ played a mix of 90s and early 2000s hits, instantly transporting me back. The air was thick with nostalgia, anticipation, and the faint scent of stale gymnasium floor cleaner. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces, some immediately recognizable, others softened by time and life experience. There were a few extra pounds here, a few less hairs there, but the essence of each person was still discernible. I headed straight for the check-in table, where a beaming former classmate, Sarah, greeted me with a warm smile. Sarah had always been kind, one of the few. She looked wonderful, her infectious energy still shining through. She handed me a name tag and a drink ticket, her eyes crinkling as she tried to place me. "It's me," I said, offering a genuine smile. "My name is Alex." Her eyes widened in recognition, and a gasp escaped her lips. Alex, she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine surprise and delight. Oh my goodness, I barely recognized you. You look amazing. It was a small moment, a simple compliment, but it felt good. Not because I needed the validation, but because it was a genuine reaction from someone who had witnessed the earlier version of me. We exchanged a few pleasantries, catching up on the broad strokes of our lives, before I moved further into the room, ready to mingle. I started by gravitating towards the edges, observing, letting myself ease into the atmosphere. I saw familiar faces from my classes, people I had shared fleeting moments with, but never truly connected with. I exchanged polite nods, a few brief hellos. It was all very cordial, surprisingly so. The cliquishness of high school seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a more mature, if sometimes superficial, camaraderie. Everyone seemed to be trying to put their best foot forward, to present a polished version of their adult selves, and in a way, I was doing the same, though my polish had been hard-earned, not just applied for the evening. I found myself chatting with a former lab partner, Emily, who was now a successful architect. We reminisced about our disastrous chemistry experiments and shared a laugh about our overly strict science teacher. It was easy, comfortable, and surprisingly enjoyable. I learned about her career, her family, her travels, and in turn, I shared snippets of my own journey, the startup, the challenges, the triumphs. There was no judgment, only genuine interest. It was a stark contrast to the guarded conversations of our youth. As the evening wore on, the alcohol flowed a little more freely, and the volume in the room steadily increased. The initial awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by genuine laughter and animated storytelling. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I was here, I was present, and I was enjoying myself. The ghosts of my past were still in the room, somewhere, but they no longer held any power. I was no longer defined by them. Then, across the crowded room, I saw him. Mark. He was standing near the bar, talking animatedly with a group of guys, his posture still radiating that familiar, arrogant swagger, though a little less defined now, a little softer around the edges. He had put on some weight, his hair was thinning slightly, and the cruel glint in his eye was still there, but it seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a sort of weary cynicism. He looked ordinary, not the larger-than-life tormentor of my memories, but just another guy trying to make an impression. Kevin and I had been lost in our own conversation, a comfortable back and forth about old teachers and forgotten school plays, when my gaze snagged on Mark. Kevin followed my line of sight, his head tilting slightly, then his brow furrowed. The easy smile he had been wearing vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression I knew all too well. It was the look he wore when he was trying to suppress a surge of anger, a protective stance he often adopted on my behalf. He didn't need to ask who it was. The air around us seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken history. For a moment, we just stood there, two statues in a sea of movement and noise, our eyes fixed on the man who had once cast such a long shadow over our adolescence. My initial thought, the one that had surfaced moments before, was that Mark looked ordinary. But as Kevin's gaze sharpened, a different feeling began to prickle at my skin. The prickling feeling wasn't just about recognition anymore. It was a visceral understanding that the ordinariness I had first perceived was a carefully constructed facade, or perhaps, worse, a sign of something truly unsettling. Mark wasn't just older, he was diminished. The sharp, predatory edge he had once wielded, the one that had made him so terrifyingly charismatic, seemed to have dulled, replaced by a kind of listlessness. His shoulders, once broad and confident, now slumped slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight. His hair, still dark, was thinning at the crown, and there were deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, not from laughter, but from what looked like chronic exhaustion or bitterness. It was the eyes that truly unsettled me. They were still that same piercing blue, but the light behind them seemed to have gone out. There was a vacancy there, a hollowness that sent a chill down my spine. It was as if the very essence of him, the spark that had ignited his ambition and fueled his cruel charm, had been extinguished. It was not merely tiredness, it was an absence, a profound void where a vibrant, dangerous intelligence once resided. He looked less like a man worn down by life, and more like a vessel emptied, left to drift. My mind raced, trying to reconcile this ghost with the formidable presence I remembered. The Mark I knew had moved through the world with an almost insolent confidence, his gaze sharp, assessing, always looking for an advantage, a weakness to exploit. He had possessed an almost magnetic pull, drawing people in only to discard them when they no longer served his purpose. To see that intensity replaced by such blankness was jarring, a fundamental shift in the fabric of my own past. A cold knot formed in my stomach, distinct from the initial jolt of recognition. This was not merely aging or the natural toll of time. This was a decay of spirit, a visible erosion of the very core of who he was. It was unsettling not just because it was Mark, but because it suggested a profound suffering, a complete dismantling of the self. And a part of me, the part that still harbored the echoes of old hurts, found itself grappling with a strange, unwelcome sensation. Pity for the man who had once been my tormentor, my fascination, my undoing. The thought felt perverse, a betrayal of every scar he had left on me. He had been a force, a whirlwind of ambition and calculated manipulation. I remembered the way he would command a room without raising his voice, his mere presence enough to shift the atmosphere. His laughter, once a rich, booming sound, could turn chillingly cold in an instant, a prelude to a cutting remark or a strategic withdrawal. He had been a master of perception, able to read people with an uncanny accuracy, using their hopes and fears against them. That piercing blue gaze, then, had been a weapon, dissecting, analyzing, always one step ahead. Now those same eyes saw nothing, or perhaps saw too much of nothing. They were windows into an empty room. The memory of his former vitality made his current state even more stark. It was like watching a once magnificent predator, now caged and declawed, reduced to pacing listlessly, its eyes devoid of hunger. What could have done this? What kind of crucible could have taken such a vibrant, albeit toxic, fire and reduced it to ash? My mind, against my will, began to construct scenarios, each one darker than the last. Had he finally pushed too far? Had his manipulations backfired spectacularly? Or had something more insidious, more personal, finally caught up to him? I found myself holding my breath, an involuntary reaction to the weight of his presence, even diminished as it was. I was still hidden, tucked away in the corner of the small, unassuming cafe, my coffee long forgotten and growing cold. He was across the room, seated alone at a small table near the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street, seemingly oblivious to the gentle hum of conversation and clatter of crockery around him. He had not ordered anything, just sat there, a ghost haunting a public space. The careful facade I had initially noted, the tailored but slightly rumpled suit, the expensive watch, now seemed less like a deliberate front and more like the last vestiges of a former life, clinging to him out of habit. It was a uniform worn by a soldier who had long since lost his war. The air around him felt heavy, imbued with a quiet despair that was almost palpable. I wanted to look away, to break the spell of this morbid curiosity, but I could not. It was like witnessing a slow-motion tragedy, a personal apocalypse playing out in front of me. My own past with Mark was a tangled web of fascination and fear, of admiration and deep-seated resentment. He had been a mentor, a seducer, a betrayer, sometimes all at once. He had taught me lessons I never wanted to learn, carved paths in my life I never intended to walk. Seeing him like this, stripped of his power, devoid of his terrifying charisma, felt like a strange kind of resolution, yet it offered no comfort. There was no triumph in this spectacle, only a profound sense of loss, not just for him, but for the untainted memories that might have been. This was not the justice I might have once fantasized about in my darkest moments. There was no fiery retribution, No dramatic downfall broadcast for all to see. Instead, there was this quiet internal implosion, a man hollowed out from the inside. It was far more unsettling than any grand punishment, because it spoke to a different kind of ending, one where the victim was also the executioner, or perhaps simply the last casualty of his own relentless ambition. I wondered if he was aware of the change, if he felt the emptiness as acutely as I perceived it. Did he mourn the man he once was? Or had he simply surrendered to this new, diminished existence? The thought sent a fresh shiver down my spine. The Mark I knew would have fought against such a state with every fiber of his being. He would have clawed his way back, rebuilt, reinvented. This passive acceptance, this quiet surrender, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his transformation. It implied a defeat so absolute that even his formidable will had been broken. I felt a strange urge to approach him, to speak his name, just to see if any flicker of the old Mark remained, if the sound of a familiar voice could stir something in that vacant gaze. But the urge was quickly stifled by a surge of self-preservation. What good would it do? What could I possibly say to this ghost? And what if, beneath the dullness, a shard of the old predator still lurked, ready to spring forth if provoked? The idea was absurd given his current state, but the ingrained fear was hard to shake. My body remembered the danger even if my mind was trying to process the pity. So I stayed hidden, a silent observer in the periphery of his quiet despair. I watched as he slowly raised a hand, not to signal a waiter, but to touch the deep lines around his mouth, as if tracing the map of his own suffering. There was a faint tremor in his fingers, a detail I might have missed if I had not been scrutinizing him so closely. It was a small, human gesture, one that momentarily pierced the veil of his emptiness, revealing a fragile, broken man underneath. The prickling feeling, once a warning, now felt more like a persistent question. What happened to you, Mark? What shattered the man who once seemed invincible? The answers, I knew, were likely complex and painful, perhaps even for him, and I realized with a sudden chilling clarity that I did not want to know them. Not really, because to know would be to delve back into a past I had fought so hard to escape, to reopen wounds that had only just begun to scab over. This encounter was not a closure. It was a new kind of haunting. The Mark I had feared was gone, replaced by a specter of his former self. And that specter was, in its own way, just as disturbing. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of even the most powerful wills, a testament to the fact that some battles, even those fought by the most cunning, could still be lost, utterly and irrevocably. I continued to watch him, a silent sentinel to his silent decline, until a sudden movement from him made me instinctively flinch back into the shadows of my booth, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He had not looked my way, had not noticed me, but the sheer instinct of avoidance was still potent, a testament to the deep, indelible mark he had left on me, even in his current state of profound emptiness. The coffee grew colder, mirroring the chill that had settled deep within me. The chill was not merely from the forgotten coffee, it was an internal frost, spreading from my core, seeping into my extremities. My hand, poised to lift the cup, trembled almost imperceptibly. He remained there, a statue carved from apathy and exhaustion, his gaze fixed on nothing, or perhaps on everything and finding it equally empty. The cafe bustled around him, a symphony of clinking ceramic, hushed conversations, and the hiss of the espresso machine, none of which seemed to penetrate the invisible barrier he had erected, or perhaps that life had erected around him. He was utterly alone, even in a room full of people. I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape, for the familiar anonymity of the street, the cold bite of the wind, anything to sever this unexpected, unwanted connection. Yet I stayed. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a perverse sense of obligation to bear witness to this final, tragic act. He